The park was quiet that afternoon, with only the rustling of leaves in the light breeze and the distant hum of city traffic. A man sat on a weathered green bench near the fountain. His hood was pulled low, concealing his face, and his patched, worn-out coat looked like it hadn't been washed in ages. Beside him lay a crumpled and dirty brown paper bag. His mismatched, tattered sneakers peeked out from the frayed cuffs of his jeans. He didn't look up as a police car slowly rolled into the park's parking lot. 2 officers stepped out, their boots crunching on gravel as they surveyed the area. One of them, a young officer with a close-cropped haircut and a badge gleaming under the late afternoon sun, adjusted his belt and glanced at his partner. "Another vagrant," the young officer muttered, nodding toward the man on the bench. "This park is turning into a homeless camp these days." His partner, a stocky man in his 40s with a weary expression and a coffee-stained uniform, sighed. "Let's see what he's up to. Might not be anything serious." The 2 officers approached the bench, their footsteps deliberate and heavy. The man didn't react, his gaze remaining fixed on the ground as if he hadn't noticed them. "You can't sit here all day," the young officer said sharply, his tone brisk. "This is a public park, not your living room." The man finally looked up, his eyes shadowed beneath the hood. His familiar face, unmistakable, was none other than Donald Trump. He didn't speak, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached for the brown paper bag beside him. The young officer tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his baton. "Easy," the older officer whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Don't escalate this." The man pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and began unwrapping it slowly. His movements were calm, unthreatening. He took a bite, chewing deliberately as if oblivious to their presence. "Are you even listening to me?" the young officer snapped, stepping closer. "I said you can't sit here all day. Don't you have anywhere else to go?" The man swallowed his bite, his eyes flicking to the officer for a brief moment before returning to the sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just having lunch." "That's not the point," the young officer retorted, his tone growing sharper. "People like you make this place look bad, scare off families and tourists." The older officer sighed again, crossing his arms as he observed the exchange. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone gruff but less confrontational than his partner's. The man hesitated, his hand tightening slightly around the sandwich. "Nick," he finally replied. "Nick Ethan." The young officer smirked derisively, clearly unimpressed. "Nick Ethan? Huh, what? Are you a Backstreet Boy or something?" The man didn't respond, his face remaining impassive as he continued eating. His silence seemed to irritate the young officer further. He stepped closer, looming over the man on the bench. "Let me see some ID," he demanded. The man carefully set the sandwich down, reaching into his coat pocket with measured movements. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to the officer. The officer opened it with a practiced motion. The ID inside appeared legitimate, though it didn't quite match the disheveled man sitting before them. The young officer frowned, staring at the ID before handing it back. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" he asked. "Why aren't you in a shelter or something?" "I like the fresh air," the man replied simply, tucking the wallet back into his coat. "Is that a crime?" The older officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "He's not breaking any laws," he said quietly. "We can't make him leave." "Maybe not," the young officer muttered, narrowing his eyes. "But we can make him uncomfortable." The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react. Instead, he picked up the sandwich again and took another slow bite. The tension between him and the officers grew, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. They slowed their steps, curiosity evident as they glanced toward the bench. "Hey," A woman walking her dog hesitated, speaking up cautiously. "He's not hurting anyone. Why are you bothering him?" The young officer turned to her, his face hard. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "This is a public park," she replied, her tone firmer now. "He has as much right to be here as anyone else." The older officer stepped forward, raising a hand in a placating gesture. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job," he said. "Please, move along." The woman hesitated, gripping her dog's leash tightly as she glanced between the man on the bench and the two officers. Finally, she shook her head, muttering something under her breath as she continued walking. The man watched her go, a flicker of emotion crossing his face, perhaps amusement, perhaps irritation. He set the sandwich down again, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his voice calm but with a subtle edge. "You're not under arrest," the older officer said, though his partner shot him a warning look. "But you should find somewhere else to sit." The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the young officer for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood, picking up the paper bag and tucking it under his arm. He was tall, taller than both officers, and as he adjusted his hood, a strand of dark hair fell across his forehead. "Have a good day, gentlemen," he said, his voice low but laden with meaning. The young officer watched him walk away, his face darkening. "Did you see the way he looked at me?" he muttered to his partner. "He thinks he's better than us." "Let it go," the older officer replied, his tone weary. "He's not worth the paperwork." The man walked down the path, his steps slow and deliberate, the tension in the park gradually fading. Yet something lingered in the air, a silent challenge, an unresolved spark. The young officer continued to watch the man until he disappeared from sight, his jaw clenched. "I don't trust him," he finally said, his voice laced with suspicion. "There's something off about him." "You don't have to trust him," the older officer replied. "You just have to leave him alone." The man vanished around a bend, the paper bag still tucked securely under his arm. But as he turned the corner, a faint smile played on his lips. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. As the man walked toward a quieter corner of the park, his steps were slow and deliberate, his demeanor unhurried. He eventually reached a bench nestled beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient oak tree. The air here was different, cooler, more serene, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Placing the crumpled paper bag carefully beside him, he lowered himself onto the bench, easing into a posture of effortless calm. With his head tilted slightly back, he closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Yet, despite his outward serenity, there was an unmistakable sense of purpose in the way he sat, like someone waiting, though for what or whom was unclear. The stillness didn't last long. The gravel path leading to his secluded spot betrayed the approach of two joggers. Their sneakers crunched against the tiny stones in a rhythmic pattern, the sound punctuated by snippets of a light-hearted conversation. As they drew closer, their pace slowed, their conversation faltering when they noticed the man on the bench. One of the joggers, a middle-aged man with a sharp haircut and a sleek fitness watch strapped to his wrist, frowned slightly. His posture stiffened, and he shot a pointed glance toward his companion. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the man on the bench to hear, he murmured, "Should we call someone? He doesn't look right." The man on the bench opened his eyes lazily, his gaze sweeping briefly over the joggers before returning to the sky above. His face remained unreadable, as if the words spoken had evaporated into the air. Yet, the weight of his silence thickened the atmosphere, turning the idle judgment into something palpably uncomfortable. The joggers exchanged uneasy looks. Their conversation did not resume as they continued on their way, their steps quicker, and less rhythmic than before. It was as if the mere presence of the man had unsettled the balance of their carefree routine. Not long after, the tranquility of the space was shattered again. This time, it was the sound of laughter, high-pitched, chaotic, and youthful, carried through the air like ripples on a pond. A group of teenagers on bicycles sped down the path, weaving playfully between the trees. Their voices were filled with exuberance, their energy brimming with the invincibility of youth. One of the boys, at the head of the pack, caught sight of the man sitting alone on the bench. With an exaggerated wave of his arm, he signaled for his friends to stop. They skidded to a halt, the wheels of their bikes spraying tiny stones across the path. "Look at that!" the boy exclaimed, his wide grin splitting his face. He pointed directly at the man on the bench, his voice loud and intrusive. "Hey, mister, are you homeless?" The man did not respond. His calm gaze settled on the boy for a moment, a flicker of curiosity in his otherwise detached expression. He made no effort to speak, no movement to acknowledge the boy's words, but his very silence seemed to draw the group closer. The boy, emboldened by the man's lack of reaction, dismounted his bike. He took a few steps forward, his grin stretching wider. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted, his tone mocking. "Did you lose your house playing Fortnite or something?" Behind him, his friends erupted into laughter, the sound sharp and mocking as it echoed among the trees. One of them, an older-looking boy wearing a baseball cap turned backward, pulled out his phone. He raised it, the lens aimed squarely at the man on the bench. "Come on, say something," the boy with the phone urged, his tone dripping with ridicule. "Tell us your story. Old man, what are you doing here?" The man's composure did not falter. For a long moment, he remained silent, his hands resting lightly on his lap. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was deep, unhurried, and carried a weight that immediately shifted the dynamic. "You kids should move along," he said, his tone steady, his eyes unwavering. "This isn't a place for games." The laughter died almost instantly. The boys glanced at each other, their confidence visibly faltering. There was something in the man's voice, a quiet authority, a commanding presence, that made them hesitate. It wasn't loud or angry, but it carried an unspoken command that none of them dared defy. The boy with the phone lowered it slightly, his grin fading as he searched for a retort that didn't come. The others shuffled awkwardly, their bikes no longer the center of their boisterous energy. Before they could decide whether to leave or stay, another sound reached their ears, the low, distinct hum of an approaching vehicle. Moments later, a police car rolled into view, its polished exterior gleaming in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. The boys scattered almost immediately, their bikes kicking up a cloud of dust as they pedaled away in all directions. The sound of their retreating wheels faded quickly, leaving behind only the faint crunch of gravel beneath the police car's tires as it came to a stop nearby. The door opened, and the young officer from earlier stepped out, his expression unreadable but his gaze sharp as it immediately fixed on the man on the bench. "There you are again," the young officer said as he strode purposefully toward the man on the bench. His boots crunched loudly against the gravel path, announcing his approach with every step. His tone was sharp, frustration evident as he added, "Can't you find another park to sit in?" The man didn't move. His posture remained as relaxed as it had been moments earlier, one leg crossed over the other, his hands resting lightly on the bench, and his gaze was calm as it met the officer's. "Is sitting on a park bench a crime now?" he asked, his voice steady and unhurried. "Don't get smart with me," the officer growled, his hand reflexively moving to rest on his hip where his baton hung. His irritation was palpable. "You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what you're up to, but I'll find out." The man tilted his head ever so slightly, his expression unchanged. "Why don't you just tell me what crime I'm committing?" he said evenly, "and I'll explain why I'm here." The officer stopped short, his jaw tightening, his hands flexed at his sides as if he were holding himself back from saying something he might regret. "I told you," he said through clenched teeth. "Your behavior isn't normal. You're not like normal people." "Normal people," the man repeated slowly, his tone deliberate and tinged with quiet challenge. His gaze didn't waver as he asked, "How exactly do you define normal?" The officer faltered, his expression hardening as he tried to find the right words. Instead of answering, he took another step closer, his presence looming. "Normal people don't sit here all day just to provoke the police," he said finally, his voice a low growl. "Who do you think you are?" The man on the bench leaned back slightly, his demeanor as composed as ever. He let the question hang in the air for a moment before replying. "I think I'm a citizen enjoying my right to be in a public park." His tone was calm but firm, and his next words were pointed. "And who do you think you are to decide who gets to sit here?" The question seemed to hang heavily in the space between them. For a moment, the young officer's eyes narrowed as if he were searching for a retort sharp enough to cut through the man's quiet defiance. Before he could speak, another voice broke the tension. "That's enough," said the older officer, his tone weary but firm. He had been standing near the patrol car, observing the exchange, but now he walked over with deliberate steps. His face bore the marks of fatigue, not just from the day, but from years of similar confrontations. "He's not breaking any laws," the older officer continued, addressing his colleague. "We have no reason to keep bothering him." The younger officer whipped his head around to face his partner, disbelief flashing across his face. "I don't trust him," he said, his voice brimming with certainty. "His ID is fake. We should double-check it." The older officer sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if to stave off a headache. "We already checked it," he said, his words clipped. "Everything came back legitimate." "That's impossible," the younger officer muttered under his breath. He pulled out his radio with a frustrated motion, the static crackling as he keyed it on. "Unit 12 here," he said briskly, his tone cold. "I need a recheck on an individual named Nick Ethan." The man on the bench remained still, showing no sign of surprise or concern. His gaze flickered briefly to the radio in the officer's hand before returning to some distant point in the park. There was a faint air of detachment in the way he watched the scene unfold, as if he were a spectator rather than a participant. The response came back over the radio after a brief pause. "Unit 12, the dispatcher's voice crackled. No records matched the provided ID. The young officer froze, his fingers tightening around the radio. His face hardened, and a flush of red crept up his neck. "That can't be," he shouted, his voice louder than necessary. "There must be some mistake." The man on the bench allowed himself a faint smile, his expression calm and composed. "Maybe your system is faulty," he said lightly. "Or maybe you're searching for something that doesn't exist." The words, spoken with quiet certainty, seemed to infuriate the young officer further. He stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes blazing with frustration. "Don't play games with me," he snarled, his voice low but charged with anger. Before he could take another step, the older officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder, holding him back. "We're done here," he said, his tone resolute. "Stand down before you make this worse." The younger officer hesitated, his eyes locked on the man on the bench. For a moment, it looked as though he might resist, but then he exhaled sharply and stepped back. His gaze never left the man as he retreated toward the patrol car. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low but full of venom. He yanked the car door open and slammed it shut with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the quiet park. The man on the bench remained seated, his posture unchanged. His calm gaze followed the patrol car as it idled for a moment before pulling away. Only when the car disappeared from sight did he shift slightly, leaning back against the bench with an air of quiet satisfaction. The man on the bench watched as the patrol car slowly rolled away, his eyes glinting with understanding. Once the car disappeared from sight, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small device, perfectly sized to fit in his hand. He turned it over a few times, a faint smile playing on his lips. The man remained seated, the small device still resting securely in his hand. As he turned it over again, the smile lingered. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. Before long, the sound of a police car echoed through the park again. The patrol car rolled in slowly, but this time only the young officer stepped out. His partner had declined to join, dismissing this as a pointless pursuit. The young officer approached the bench with a steely determination in his eyes. "Here we go again," he said coldly. "I told you, I don't trust you. Your ID is fake, and I'm going to uncover the truth." The man lifted his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "Show me your real ID," the young officer demanded, his tone sharp. "No games, no fake names, just the truth." The man slowly reached into his coat pocket, his movements entirely calm, showing no sign of resistance. The young officer tensed, his hand hovering near his baton, ready to act if there was any hint of danger. But the man didn't pull out a weapon or another ID. Instead, he retrieved a sleek black smartphone. He held it up, the screen lighting up as he tapped it. "Here's the truth," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If you want to know who I am, I'll show you." The officer frowned, leaning closer to peer at the screen. A video began to play. The footage showed the officer himself. From the moment he started harassing the man, his harsh tone, his overreaching actions, every word, every move was captured with crystal clarity, the audio sharp and undeniable. "What is this?" the young officer yelled, his voice trembling with anger. "This is a live stream," the man replied, his eyes steady and resolute. "Everything that's happened between us today has been broadcast to millions of people." The young officer's face went pale, his hands shaking as the gravity of the situation sank in. "You can't do this. This is a setup," he shouted, trying to mask his growing panic. "This isn't a setup," the man said coldly. "I didn't force you to do anything. Every action you took was your choice." The young officer stood frozen as a crowd began to gather, their numbers growing. Many in the crowd raised their phones, recording this scene. Some voiced their outrage, their shouts of disapproval echoing through the park. "That's enough," a commanding voice cut through the noise. A woman in a sharp suit stepped forward, her expression firm. A badge clipped to her hip gleamed in the sunlight. "Officer, hand over your badge and gun," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You can't do this," the young officer yelled, trying to protest. "Hand them over. Now," she ordered. "You're being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." Surrounded by undeniable evidence, the officer had no choice but to comply. Reluctantly, he handed over his badge and gun. The crowd erupted into cheers, celebrating the moment of justice. The man, now with his hood removed, turned toward one of the cameras. The familiar face of Donald Trump came into clear view. He smiled faintly and said, "Remember, with power comes responsibility. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, who will?" The applause grew louder, and his message rippled across the park and onto social media platforms. Millions were watching, and everyone understood that a spark for change had just been ignited. As the young officer was led away, his face betrayed embarrassment and disappointment. His attempts to control the situation had unraveled, and now he was at the center of unwanted attention. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, with phrases like abuse of power and disgrace resonating, underscoring the public's anger. The woman from Internal Affairs turned back to Trump, her face stern but tinged with respect. "Mr. Trump," she said, her tone softer now, "on behalf of my department, I apologize for what you experienced today. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and we will address it appropriately." Trump nodded, his expression unreadable. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." She nodded in return, clearly understanding the weight of his words. "I'll make sure your concerns are heard," she said. After she left, Trump turned back to the crowd. "This is just a small step," he said, his voice clear and strong. "If we want real change, we need to take responsibility, not just those in power, but every single one of us." The crowd erupted into applause, cheers ringing out across the park. His message resonated deeply, inspiring a collective desire for change. The video of the park incident spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, it was trending globally, with hashtags sprouting up as people from all walks of life joined the conversation. The footage, crystal clear and unedited, laid bare the tension between Donald Trump and the young officer, sparking heated debates. Millions shared, liked, and commented, their responses ranging from admiration to criticism. For many, Donald Trump's actions were seen as a bold stand against systemic issues, a way of shining a light on the unchecked power that often went unnoticed in everyday interactions. "He didn't have to do this," one commentator wrote, their post garnering thousands of likes. "But he did, and it's forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths." Others, however, questioned the morality of his approach. Was it really fair to use this officer as an example? Another user asked, even if he was wrong, was this the right way to teach that lesson? The young officer at the center of the controversy became a lightning rod for public scrutiny. His face, flushed with anger during the encounter, was now etched into the memories of millions. Suspended from duty and facing a formal investigation, he became a symbol of the very issue Trump had sought to highlight: abuse of authority. Overnight, his life changed completely. News outlets dissected every frame of the footage, analyzing his words and actions. Social media was flooded with both condemnation and, surprisingly, a few voices calling for understanding. "He's just a product of a broken system," one op-ed read. "If we want accountability, we need to fix the system, not just blame individuals." Still, the majority saw him as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how power, when misused, could unravel in an instant. Meanwhile, the officer's older colleague grappled with his own sense of responsibility. The guilt gnawed at him as he replayed the events of that day in his mind. "I should have stepped in earlier," he admitted to a close friend, his voice heavy with regret. "I saw where it was going, and I didn't do enough to stop it." For him, the fallout wasn't just about the public reaction. It was about his own integrity as an officer. He resolved to change, vowing to approach his duties with greater empathy and a renewed commitment to fairness. And then there was Donald Trump, the man at the center of it all. While the world buzzed with speculation and debate, he returned to his routine with a quiet determination. But something was different. This wasn't just about a single moment in a park. It was about the larger picture, the ripple effect that moment could create. A few days after the video went viral, Trump held a press conference. The room was packed, journalists jostling for position as camera flashes lit up the space. When he stepped onto the stage, there was a palpable hush, the kind of silence that spoke to the weight of the moment. Standing at the podium, Trump began to speak, his tone measured but resolute. "Let me start by saying this wasn't about embarrassing anyone," he said, his words cutting through the tension. "This was never about shaming an individual. It was about holding up a mirror to ourselves as a society." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We talk a lot about change," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "But change doesn't come from words alone. Change begins with accountability, and accountability begins with awareness." The room was silent, every ear tuned to his words. Trump went on to explain that the experiment wasn't born out of malice, but out of a desire to spark conversation. "Too often," he said, "we allow ourselves to get comfortable with the status quo, even when we know it's flawed. This was about discomfort, because discomfort can lead to growth." As the press conference continued, he addressed the criticisms head-on, acknowledging the ethical questions some had raised. "I understand the concerns," he said, "but sometimes, to create real change, you have to take risks. You have to be willing to challenge not just others but yourself." By the end of his speech, it was clear that Trump wasn't just defending his actions. He was challenging everyone listening to look inward. "This is bigger than me, bigger than one officer, bigger than a single park," he said. "It's about who we are and who we want to be. And that starts with asking the hard questions." The press conference ended with a standing ovation from some, thoughtful silence from others, and the undeniable feeling that something significant had begun. Even as he left the stage, the weight of his words lingered, leaving everyone in the room and beyond to grapple with what they had just witnessed. The park bench where Donald Trump had sat became a symbol. Many people visited the park to take photos, leaving notes with positive messages under the bench, inspired by the words Trump had left behind. "Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." This simple yet profound message sparked empathy, especially among those who had faced injustice or felt powerless in the face of authority. Donald Trump's actions ignited a broader discussion about the responsibility of those in positions of power within society. Small reforms began to take shape, ranging from anti-bias training programs to enhanced monitoring of police behavior. The conversation didn't end in the park that day. It spread across the globe,